My name is Femida Gwadry Sridhar, and I'm the founder CEO of Pulse InfoFrame. I'm going to, hopefully you can all see the slides that have been presented. I'm going to stop my video so you don't have to see me, and then we'll reduce the broadband on this. So the question that I was asked to address is really around patient registries and whether or not a population actually needs one. So let's go to our next slide. I think that there's a fair bit of confusion around the word registry. But advocacy groups often hear that they need a disease registry. Pharmaceutical companies believe they need a registry. Researchers talk about needing a registry. And when I think about a registry, let's think about it as almost like several pieces of Lego. And they're the building block really of defining the patient journey. So when you look at a registry and you think about what you need, don't think about sort of everything in the world that everybody else needs. Think about your own disease population and what's most important for you. So again, it is really the building block of defining the patient journey. So we could start potentially on the bottom left, you see that there are contact details. Many advocacy groups will often start with a contact registry. A contact registry essentially is to find all the people in the world who potentially have the disease of interest. And that's really just collecting information about who they are, where they live, and potentially their genomic profile. Then we want to be able to collect more information, and it may be that our contact registry isn't not big enough. So we have to really think about what are the key elements that we need in this registry. People often get caught up about, collecting everything, and sometimes collecting everything doesn't give you the information that's really critical for you to be able to make decisions. What do I mean by that? Think about yourself going to a grocery store and you have hundreds of ingredients that are in the grocery store, and you're given a choice to pick some. How do you make that kind of choice? That's really difficult to make if you don't know what you're going to be cooking. So think about your disease registry as, what is the end point? What do I actually want at the end? Do I simply want a contact registry to start? Do I want to understand the natural history of my population? Do I want information that can be shared with clinicians so there could be more research and development done? So how we define disease registry is really up to us because there's so many different definitions. Think of it as starting again with contact, natural history, clinical and biomarker information, and essentially what you're trying to do is create a story, a unique story for every single patient. And that will really help define the type of registry you need. It's really to characterize the disease, which means that you sometimes have to go back and look at what's happened in a patient's life to help inform what the future is going to look like from a drug development perspective. I don't know if people have questions now, but I'm happy to take questions later on. So Jeff, could you take me to my next slide, please? So the whole sort of area around disease registries is really confusing for many of us. When you look at regulatory agencies, they're looking for patient registries or disease registries. When you're talking to pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies, they're looking for data that comes from patient registries, etc. So when you're thinking about what you need, again, think about all of the people that you're working with in your ecosystem, your patients and patient advocacy group, the clinicians and researchers who are treating those patients, the companies who are involved in drug development, the providers, as well as the potential payers and policymakers that ultimately need data that's going to help them decide whether or not to ultimately fund a new therapy. You also don't necessarily want to invest in something that can't grow with you. So maybe today you have an Excel spreadsheet, and that's perfect for you because that Excel spreadsheet fulfills on what you need, which may be a contact registry and very little clinical information. But as you think about your longer term needs for the patient's needs in that group, then what you really want to think about, as I said in the beginning, is think about this as a Lego and a building block. Start small, where you have something that can grow with you, because you don't want to be switching out technologies every time you grow. It's just like, think about the foundation of a house. In that home, you have rooms. As your family grows, you need more rooms. So as the disease variables grow, as your needs grow, you don't want to have to keep buying new houses. You want to be able to build on what you already have. So think about a platform as a foundation. Think about whether or not that foundation will serve the needs for you to be able to grow into in the future, and essentially then make your decisions on the basis of what, not just what your today needs are, but your future needs. Many of you are probably thinking, yes, but I don't have the resources today to be building what I need in the future. And you're right. So again, what you think about is, what do I buy today? What do I start with today that I can then grow in the future without having to redo everything I've already done? Okay, so key point, it has to grow with you. As your family of patients grows, as the data grow, as the new inventions grow, you need to be able to grow the type of registry that you have today into something you're going to need in the future. And you want to future-proof it, meaning that you don't really want to keep scrapping and buying new technology all the time. Now let's talk a little bit about where is everybody in the world. Rare diseases are not just defined by a single continent. They're defined globally. And on this presentation later on, as part of this series, you'll be hearing from several advocates who came from different parts of the world. So you need to think about a registry that's actually compliant with the legislation to be able to provide you with international coverage. I apologize for the background noise. I'm at a cancer meeting right now, and there are a lot of people walking by, so apologies. But so international coverage means I need to be able to pull data from other parts of the world. I want to be able to ultimately make sure that the data that I'm pulling, I'm able to share. I'm able to characterize it in a way that's globally interpretable. But most importantly, whatever technology I invest in has to be compliant with global rules, which include GDPR, which is primarily in the UK and Europe, as well as HIPAA. And again, that is not a trivial thing to consider. So if you're, for example, collecting data in an Excel spreadsheet, and ultimately you want to be able to share your Excel data globally, that's very different than setting up a platform where you have to be compliant, but also beware that when you're sharing data in its simplest form, you still have to deal with issues such as encryption of data and safe data transfer to protect the rights of the patients. Which brings me to a deeper question and discussion point around the tools to keep your information safe. I'm not a security expert. I suspect that many of you are also not security experts. So think about what you need to keep the information safe. Think about the importance of keeping the information safe, and think about keeping it locked. There should be a key, and that key basically means that you have to be able to keep the information in a way that other people can't break the lock and get into your safe. And there are some people who are very skilled at doing that, but it's not something that you should underestimate. Then there's this whole issue of storing and transferring data. And it almost feels sometimes like there's a police person there who's regulating that, but for good reason. There are several countries in the world that do not allow their data to be transferred across borders. So even with the best of intentions, sometimes we want to be able to bring in as many people as we can with a rare disease globally, but bear in mind, often what that means is that we're in a situation where there may be some geopolitical issues that prevent us from being able to move data. So for example, we do a lot of work in Australia. The Australian government does not allow their data to transfer into some North American countries. And therefore, setting up the infrastructure and different cloud storage in different parts of the world is expensive, and therefore you don't want to be doing it as a patient advocacy group yourself. My recommendation is always to work with people who already have done it and know what they're doing, because if you do go offside and there's a breach, there's significant penalties. What about how we inform, is the data that we're collecting everything I possibly want? So when we think about data, And when I think about data, I'm always excited as a scientist because I want to be able to collect everything. But really, that's the absolute wrong thing for me to do, because collecting everything isn't necessarily going to help me answer the questions that are important for both medicine and science. And by that, I mean, start with the endpoints you're interested in. Is your main focus around helping determine the feasibility for clinical trials? Is it to help really define what a drug pipeline should look like? And if, for example, if that is the case, then what we should be looking at are what are the endpoints that are important for patients and from a patient's perspective. If you've been following some of the regulatory chatter, primarily with the FDA, they're very interested in understanding the impact of therapies on what's important to patients. What does that mean? They're often clinical biomarkers and biomarkers that are collected by physicians, by labs, and different data that's collected by the clinical side. But that doesn't really always impact or show in an appreciable impact to a patient. So let me give you an example. Let's say we took a muscular dystrophy, and in muscular dystrophy, sometimes you have patients, they use a measure called a 6-minute walk test. When you're looking at the 6-minute walk test, it's a measure that's used to be able to objectively measure from a clinical perspective how well a patient walks within a period of time. But that has less relevance to a patient from their own quality of life, because perhaps what they're interested in is being able to take a few steps without using an assisted device, or being able to sleep at night. So just differentiate the types of data that are important and build something with a data dictionary that's going to reflect the needs of the patient and what's important to the patient. And in doing that, then when you're considering a rare disease registry, there's another thing to remember, and that is that there are several data that are actually common across different rare diseases. So that's like the foundation of the house. And so, for example, let's say you're in a disease that is very distinct. You will always find that there are other diseases that may or may not be known today, which may have similar or dissimilar genomic profiles, but that you could learn from. So again, when you're thinking about what you're building, think about diseases that have adjacencies, but also think about how you can leverage what other people have done and define a data dictionary that is not like every single letter in the alphabet, but truly the clinical, biomarker, and patient-reported outcomes that are going to help establish a pipeline of drugs and data that is ultimately going to be interpretable. Okay? And then collecting garbage data means that you get garbage data out. And I cannot overemphasize this. Sometimes in our interest and anxiety to collect as much as we can, we end up getting data from data sources that are sometimes, even with the best intentions, a bit questionable or don't provide really clean data. So to keep data clean, there has to be a lot of quality assurance on it, recognizing that many people collect data in different systems and recognizing that different countries have different ways to characterize data. One way to really make sure that your data is going to be used and is useful is to have quality assurance, to normalize the data, to look for outliers in the data, and to question data that really doesn't make sense. So, for example, let's use a simple example. Let's say we're measuring weight and somebody puts in 400 pounds. Now, it doesn't mean people can't weigh 400 pounds, but the likelihood of that is slim. So we'd have to question that, because as soon as you start letting in data into a database or registry where the quality of the data is questionable, the data has less value for everybody. It has less value for the researchers who now begin to see outlier data, less value for pharmaceutical companies that are interested in drug development because the data becomes suspect. And ultimately, if the data is not going to be used for something meaningful that's going to actually impact on patient lives, then what's the point of collecting data? It's better to have no data than to have dirty data. And then the most important question is, how do I pick, right? Let's go back to the analogy of the grocery store. You've got multiple brands of the same ingredient. Which one is best for you? Is it the lowest price? Is it the tastiest? Is it the biggest name? What is it? We always firmly believe, and I've always done this my entire career, is really work with people who understand what your needs are. Don't just go brand name shopping because that's what everybody else is doing. Really think about who are the people who understand the rare disease space? Who are the people that I can grow with? What's the company that will work with us strategically and help us understand and provide advice and guidance? So don't just think about a technology as a technology that you're buying, because then you can just go buy any technology. Think about the choice you make as one that will help influence the future for your disease, and do it on the basis of picking somebody who is not just a technology, but understands disease and has deep content expertise. Can I have the next slide, please? So now, how can you use this great registry that you've been working on? So for advocacy organizations, what a great opportunity for knowledge translation. People are excited to know what's going on in the world. And often patients don't really care about papers that people like us publish in journals, but they do care about the impact that it's going to have on new drugs, new treatments, new opportunities to help define the future for drug development. So communicate. Conduct surveys from your patient group. Ask them how they feel. Just getting treatment or waiting for treatment causes a lot of anxiety, and there are a tremendous number of impacts on quality of life. Use the opportunity through your network to really understand your population and the pulse of the population. If there are new trials that have been approved, disseminate and share those information. And then find out about the survivorship. Find out about things that aren't normally known to everybody. So for example, there are a lot of areas around social listening, around listening to the voice of the patient. Collect that information, use it in a way that's meaningful to gain insights. And ultimately, it's really important to have a refreshed and current database of people, because when there are new clinical trial opportunities, those patients really want to be contacted, and make sure that you're using proper consenting processes and that the privacy and security of the patients at all times is maintained. Next slide, Jeff. So this is the last slide, and I won't necessarily focus on a lot of it, but I think we've covered a lot of this. Have a clear purpose. Don't go build something if you don't know what you're going to do with it. It's different and difficult for advocacy groups to invest and build their own technology. There are lots of other people who build technology. Work with them, interview them, make sure they understand your needs. Design the registry in a way that you can ultimately grow into it, and you have to be able to think about the cloud. Having an on-prem solution now or on the premises is very important. Use standards. These are global data standards, not just US standards. OMOP is an ontology, and to simplify it, you call something blood pressure, I call it hypertension. We mean the same thing, but you have to be able to map it, otherwise it's very, very difficult for people. Free text is great, but it's not the only way to collect data. Use validated instruments and make sure that those validated instruments can be provided in different languages, because rare diseases are global. And again, if data has already been collected, it's not wasted. The data can be used, it can be cleaned, and it can be mapped. So at the end of the day, when you're looking at creating registries, you want to create a unique registry that's going to define the needs of your patients, but you want to be able to leverage technology, hopefully, that's already been done. And at the end of the day, we need to look back so that we can really look forward. And that's the thought I'll leave you with, because natural history, understanding what happens to patients, means that we have to look back and then prospectively understand what a patient goes through, because each patient is an individual. And if we don't understand the individual, then we won't be able to develop drugs in a way that are meaningful for the masses of patients who have rare diseases. So thank you. And I think there's one more slide, which is probably the question slide. Thank you for your time. happy to take any questions if anybody has any. I don't hear any questions. Is there anybody on the call? Hopefully there is. Jeff, do you have any questions? I don't have any questions coming from people.
Hi, it's Eden. It's not Jeff. We switched.
Hi.
How are you? Thank you so much for doing this. That was fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity.
So I think the question that we get most often that comes through this direction is, what is the biggest obstacle, or what does a patient group need to do first as far as an assessment? Is there kind of a baseline assessment or questionnaire that exists anywhere out there that you know of that kind of ticks those boxes that you discussed? Because obviously bad data, you'd rather have no data at all. I love that quote. We need to put that on our social media channels. But is there any kind of tool out there for the group or the organization who's just kind of dipping their toe in to make that assessment at a very basic level?
Yeah, so I think that there are a number of tools that have been released. I think NCATS has actually built a little questionnaire. We have an intake questionnaire that we use with patients, but it's the NCATS group. David Foggenbaum at Global Genes gave a great presentation around what are the things that patients should think about. Some of those are summarized in my slides, where you want to think holistically and not think too big. It doesn't mean that you don't have a view to the future, but don't buy a Ferrari if you need a Fiat. Now, we probably shouldn't put that quote up because I'll offend every country, but those are both Italian cars. Notwithstanding that, think about starting what you need today and into the future. So the NCATS would be the place that I would go for questionnaires, and then we're certainly happy to give you what we use for you to share with your audience.
That would be absolutely fantastic.
Any other questions? Any concerns? Are there challenges that people have other than what you've just raised, Eden, which is where to start? What are the right questions to even ask?
Not to totally monopolize your time, but
Okay.
the next question is always funding. What does that look like? If a nonprofit organization is very small and they're just kind of getting their feet under them, how do they even afford something like this?
Well, that's why I think the starting small is really important, because otherwise it's overwhelming. And yes, there are some free solutions out there, but they are not necessarily mapped to the standard that the FDA requires. So I think that they're great options. And I don't really want to talk about what we do as a company because that's not why I'm here, but we work with very small advocacy groups to just get them started so that they can sort of think about the future in a very low cost or cost effective way. Some of the work that we do at the Orphan Disease Center at UPenn is also focused on helping tiny advocacy groups or advocacy groups that are thinking about the future. So you can start with a contact registry, just collect very few data elements, 10 to 50 maximum, and then take some time and think about what you need as opposed to rushing into it. And then we actually work strategically with people to help them understand their needs and help them put together a funding model. It always becomes easier if there are pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies with a drug pipeline or a therapy pipeline, and then we can think through what a funding model looks like. There are many ways. There are foundations, there are companies, they're building consortia. They're also bringing, a lot of rare disease groups together so they can share the same platform. So it's a joint investment. It's not just one person trying to pay for everything.
Femida?
Yes, hi.
Hi, a question for you. Could you give us an example or two of some breakthroughs or wins for an advocacy group that have resulted from some registries that you're aware of?
Well, I think a great example would be the CDKL5 registry at UPenn. When we started that registry, there was one drug that had previously been in development, and patients were recruited in Europe. There were 15 patients recruited, and because the data had not been um, uh, fully vetted, only 5 of those patients were deemed to be eligible by the regulators. So it was really heartbreaking. So when we started the ODC registry, the CDKL5 patient community came together, and a big win is that because of the high quality natural history data that's being collected now, there are 4 companies developing drugs in CDKL5. To me, that's a win for a patient, right? High quality data that's going to help inform the drug development. The other is Castleman's disease, and you look at David Feigenbaum's story in his new book that's come out. He almost died. He was a patient, he's a physician. There's a major trial ongoing, and that's really exciting. So those are maybe a little bit more advanced, but even Friedreich's ataxia and the work that they're doing, trying to bring together the global community. I think as soon as patients have the opportunity to participate in trials, and as soon as companies are interested in drug development, those are really the wins, I believe, from a patient's perspective.
Thank you.
Alan, did you have a question? Or are you going to be on mute? Alan is just chatting. He has no voice. Alan everywhere with no voice. Put that down. Okay, of course. Anyway, if there are no other questions, I want to thank everybody for participating. I know that you've done a recording, and thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.